There we go, right there. United Way of Texas Gulf Coast and the Citizens Fund Regional Mobility Analysis, and this was completed in 2006. So it's fairly current. What happened is that they looked at the geographic area around Houston, Harris County, Fort Bend County, Montgomery, Waller, and those counties, and really looking at older people, so people 55 and older, people with disabilities and low income, to see what are the needs, what's not being met, and to come up with a general regional mobility file for that population. What we found, no surprises I don't think, is that the mobility of people with disabilities as well as seniors and low income people is really tenuous, even with those people that drive. We're looking at a huge area. Where people had the most problems was in medical care and groceries. How are they going to get there? And especially in this area, if you live in Harris County, it's difficult to get around Harris County. But if you live in Fort Bend County or Montgomery County and your doctor is at the medical center and you're a senior, how are you going to get there? Metrolift doesn't go outside of the Harris County boundaries. The RIDES program through Harris County also doesn't go outside those boundaries. How do you get there? A lot of people just don't go. Can't get there, I'm just not going to go. Or they depend on somebody else to take them. Sometimes family members work, and unfortunately doctors don't work at night and on weekends, so it makes it really difficult. What we found here within Harris County is that the majority of seniors, in this study it was 60 and over, have to get rides from other people. Okay, that makes it difficult. And even if they do drive, a lot of our older people don't like to get on the freeways. And to be real honest with you, I don't blame them. When we ask them to self-describe themselves, okay, this is what we got. With the highest amount of people, 62% saying that they have difficulty getting around in general. Okay, those who were unable to travel, and this is the over 60 population in the lilac there, and that means that they needed to go somewhere, had no way of getting there. 68.8% of the people couldn't get there. Under 59, which is really interesting, was 65%. We have real issues here with our senior population, and it's not just our seniors. How many people could not make it to medical services? Okay, in the region, you can see almost 60%. All of Harris County, the same number. Harris County people over 60, almost 73%. Could not get to medical services. Now that says something. We're talking about healthcare reform, and we can't get people who need medical care to their physicians or for tests or to anywhere that they need to go. How many people were unable to access groceries or shopping, which could be to the pharmacy, it could be anywhere else. In terms of the other services, in the region, it's pretty, for groceries, pretty evenly spread there. Shopping, again, in Harris County, people over 60 had the hardest time shopping, which could be, going to a pharmacy, so they're not taking their meds the way they should. Okay, unable to reach other appointments. Going down to the Social Security office, Medicare, other social services. The numbers are, it's about a third all the way across. And how many people had problems getting there because the services cost too much in terms of transportation? In Harris County, over a third have problems getting to where they need to go because of the cost. If you've ever taken a cab within Harris County, you know. Okay, another surprise here was how many people are afraid to travel alone? Okay, here I am, I'm 75 years old, I need to go to the doctor. I'm not going alone. I'm afraid to take the bus, I'm afraid to take the train, I might get lost, how am I going to know where to get off? People over 60, more than half of them. Traveling to another city, 37% in Harris County over 60 had problems doing that. The volume of traffic, too much traffic, unsafe to walk, 23% of Harris County residents. Missing and broken sidewalks. I mean, what happened to walkability? We really don't have it, and we did, with our volunteers, our AARP volunteers, we did some walkability studies and pedestrian audits. And we went to, unfortunately, Harris County has a very, very high rate of fatalities among older pedestrians, or pedestrians in general. We went out there and we had our volunteers trying to cross over 6 lanes of traffic. We were at Bel Air and Hillcroft. It can't be done. It is impossible to be done. We saw a mother with a baby in a stroller, couldn't make it across. We saw a teenager running. He couldn't make it across. Now, how do you take somebody who's on a walker and has just gone grocery shopping and expect them to make it across? What happened to countdown lights? You know, we don't have that. We can't do it. And unfortunately, that intersection isn't the only one in the city. So what we really endorse, and I think almost everybody up here has said this in terms of livable communities, is a complete streets model. And the pictures that Jeff showed were really complete streets. And what it is, it's just a model where we can have bicyclists, we can have walkers, we can have cars, we can have just a pleasing environment that's safe for everybody. People can jog, whatever, walking or down the same street. And again, a livable community really makes it livable for everyone. We're not just looking at seniors, we're looking at the whole general population. So when we're always looking for volunteers. So if anybody in this room is interested in volunteering on any of these issues, please, please let us know.
Our last speaker of the night is Christoph Speyer of Christoph Spieler of Morris Architects. Excuse me. He's a professional engineer and director of technology and innovation for Morris Architects. He teaches courses in the Rice School of Architecture. He chairs the editorial committee of Site Magazine and also writes about transportation in cities in his blog, which is called Intermodality. What is the website for that?
www.ctchouston.org/intermodality.
There it is. You can find it on ctc.org. So it's on their website. And he's going to highlight disparities and how the federal government funds highway and transit projects. I guess kind of jumping off from where Carol was talking about this issue before. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Okay, I want to talk today about buckets, because it turns out one of the most important topics in transportation funding is buckets. We can think about transportation funding in terms of amounts of money. We can think of transportation funding in terms of a big pie. But what you really have to think about is this pie of federal transportation funds isn't just about modes, it's about different organizations which all have hard to remember initials. But it turns out these hard to remember initials are changing your life every day. So what I want to talk about today is two of these agencies, the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration, and a little bit about how they're driving projects here locally. The federal government has been in the road transportation business since the 1890s. Now, if you think back to the 1890s, in the 1890s there were no roads. There was no concept of federal transportation funding of any sort. All of the transit, be it intercity or within a city, was privately funded and for profit. And most people did not actually believe that good roads were a problem. The Federal Highway Administration started as an evangelist to convince states to build roads. They started as technical experts who gave people guidance. They set out the model for how state departments of transportation were to be organized. And as the feds increasingly got into the roadway funding business, this is the Eisenhower interstate system, that structure that they had built of the Federal Highway Administration being an advocate for building roads stayed. So they built partnerships with all the state DOTs and essentially acted as a conduit for getting that funding to the states. Along the way, we reached a really interesting point. The federal government got involved in transportation funding because it was interstate transportation. That's why we built the interstate highways. What's happened along the way is that most interstate highway travel isn't actually interstate. The interstates have become the backbone of transportation in our cities. So the federal government has gotten intimately involved in people's drive to the grocery store. And if you look at what a highway network looks like, this is our federally funded highway network in Texas. Look at the Houston region here. FM 1960 is a federal highway. Westheimer is a federal highway and can get this federal highway funding. I want to talk about one project in specific because looking at a specific project here will give us a good idea of how this works. This is the Grand Parkway. We've heard it mentioned already, a highway through the middle of nowhere in West Houston. What steps do you need to go through to build this project? First of all, you need to add it to the regional plan. That turns out to be trivial if you're building a highway. The Grand Parkway was added in 1966. We didn't have the 610 loop yet this highway was on the general plan. Then you need environmental clearance. We went through that process on the Grand Parkway, had a couple public hearings, printed out reams of paper. What's interesting about this report is it basically found there's no environmental impact. Mind you, you're building through the best bird habitat in Texas, but no, there's no environmental impact, and the Fed signed off on that, so you're good to go there. And then you go for funding. And basically, if your state highway department wants to build the project, the feds are going to fund it. And not on the Grand Parkway, but on most highways, the feds are actually going to pay for 80% of it. So you get your check, done with the process. What's not in that process is anything about cost effectiveness. And if you're in favor of the Grand Parkway, that's a good thing because this thing isn't even close to cost effective. Over its lifetime, cost $1 billion to build and maintain and generate only $162 million in gas taxes. That's worse fare box return than most transit systems in the United States. The reason, of course, why we're building this thing is actually to generate development. It's not a transportation project. It's a development project that's being funded as a transportation project because there's no cost effectiveness metric in there. So now let's turn to the FTA. The feds have been in the transit business since about 1961, and through that entire period, there has been less transit funding than there have been projects going after it. So the Federal Transit Administration figures they're a gatekeeper. Their job is to allocate limited funds only to the most deserving systems. So let's look at a local project here. Southeast Line connects downtown to the University of Houston, two major activity centers right here. Start and alternatives analysis, December 2001 through November 2003, several rounds of public hearings. Mind you, this is something you don't have to do on a highway project. Then you have a public vote on it. And 2003, the voters approved this. Mind you, the voters do not have to approve highway projects. Add the project to the regional plan, hold some public workshops. Then you got to meet cost effectiveness requirements. And well, you don't have to do that for highways. And in this case, it meant the numbers didn't add up and a light rail line turned into a bus line instead because the cost effectiveness rating was not there. Then we go through an environmental process, multiple rounds of public hearings to get there. And And then Metro figures out that actually you can do some things with these cost effectiveness numbers, and you go back to a light rail system, which is what the voters wanted initially. And then the FDA comes back and says, wait, you can't do that. Now you need to go through another environmental process. So you spend another year going through that process. And then the feds are, okay, you're done with environmental process. Now we need you to do a risk assessment, which incidentally isn't even in the law, but the feds required it anyway. And we're still in that process. And then in the end, you might get funded. Mind you, they got $30 million from the stimulus for this money, but that's only after the congressional representatives talked to the FDA multiple times to free up that money. And even if you've passed all of these hurdles, the feds are going to fund 50%. So transit is being held to a vastly different standard here. Compare these two projects, 15 miles for the Grand Parkway, 6.5 miles for the Southeast Line. Very similar costs. But look at these numbers. Grand Parkway serves 17,000 people in jobs. Southeast Line serves 163,000. Which project do you want to fund here? And especially if you look at what Obama is saying about what our priorities are. The administration believes that people should have options to get to work, school, the grocery, or the doctor that do not rely solely on driving. We want to transform our transportation system into a truly multimodal system with strong alternatives to driving in order to maximize highway capacity, combat traffic congestion, reduce our reliance on oil, and decrease greenhouse gas emissions. This is good words, but what I just showed you is our current transportation funding process does not back any of these up. Our current process is designed to build bad projects and penalize good ones. So what I say to you right now is you ought to care about buckets, and you ought to care about this reauthorization, as fundamentally these buckets are driving the decisions on what kind of city you are living in today. So this is why fundamentally you need to care about federal transportation reauthorization, because it will determine what kind of neighborhood you are able to live in tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks to our panel. Let's give them another big hand, and to David Crossley also. I think Christoph has given me a good lead into comment cards. We have comment cards that are available for you. It doesn't have to be a comment to us. It's comments that you may wish to make to our congressional delegation. So, and Robin will have more to say after the question period about how we can take action to show our love, affection, and desire for a better future for our city. We have time for questions. We'll go till 8:45 with questions. You want to go that far? 8:45? We'll take as long as we need. And so we can take questions coming up, or they'll be picked up on paper, or you can approach the microphone and ask your question or make your statement, whatever the case may be. While we're collecting, so maybe I'll just kick it off with a question. One of the things I was writing while other speakers were talking was, where are the politics right now on these issues? And I guess, Christoph, you started that process of answering it, and it sounds pretty dismal, at least as to how the bureaucracies are constituted and all of their incentives are created. I'm assuming this has come about through the lobbying process over all the years, but maybe you'll tell us a little bit more about how we got there. Is it the lobbying process that's gone on over decades and generation? And will it take a similar amount of time to reverse that? And maybe some other panelists have some comments as well about the politics of where we stand.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a definite politics to this. When they say there's a road lobby, they mean it. I mean, I was sitting at a meeting where the transportation secretary spoke here in Houston, and somebody walks up to me and talks about the Grand Parkway, and we're talking about the Grand Parkway and how it's a stupid project, and the person next to me turns to me and says, what project are you talking about? I say the Grand Parkway, and he says, we have to build that. And I turn to him and say, why? And he says, I have one of the engineering contracts. I mean, there is that reasoning behind it, but mind you, these things can turn on a dime. If you look at how the interstate system was authorized, up until the last moment, it was entirely unclear that it might actually happen. there was a significant portion of the Congress which believed the federal government had no business building highways, that states should build toll roads like the Pennsylvania Turnpike. There were multiple alternate models out there. And so sometimes these changes can actually turn about remarkably quickly. And what has been remarkable in watching the stimulus bill is Q4A, the umbrella organization here, did a remarkable job of getting the public together, talking to their representatives, and you could actually watch in successive drafts of the bill as funding got more and language got better as a result of people like all of you sending emails and calling up their representatives. So the current system isn't very great, but I think there's a real opportunity to change it.
I have a question comment. I want to congratulate those of you who particularly talked about, I'm not quite sure what the term for it was, but alternatives other than just individual cars to transport one person from point A to point B. So congratulations. I'm really glad you're thinking about that. Also, I think you said you were looking for volunteers to help. I'd appreciate your contact information if you can put it up or just announce it now.
Oh. Great. I do have cards that I can give you afterwards, or
you can put them on the...
my email is msturner@aarp.org. My phone number is 832-325-2236. And I just want to say something about what Christoph said. We can make a difference. And if every person in this room contacted your congressperson today or tomorrow and told 3 other people to do the same thing, I mean, they listen. They have to listen. And the thing that most people don't understand is that you're their constituent. You voted them. You voted them in, you can vote them out. And I'm not saying call them and, twist their arm and say, well, I voted for you and I'm not going to do that again. But they're working for you. And when enough people call, they do listen.
One other thing I would appreciate, the chairs here don't rise, so some of us in the back can't see you. When you're speaking, it would be nice if you would stand up.
Here's a question. Will people move into these dense city centers without educational improvements in HISD? Who feels good about taking that one? Jeff.
I think that I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that the percentage of households with school-age children continues to shrink as a share of the region's population. I think AARP would second me on that. I think the other thing that was curious to me, and I'm not sure the source of this, but I heard somewhere that the average tenure in an owner-occupied house in Houston is 7 years. I know I've lived in, I guess, 3 or 4 houses since I've lived here. So I think we need to perhaps think of the region in terms of different phases of life. And there may be a phase of one's life, and my daughter, by the way, went K through 12 in HISD, so it is possible, but I understand some people don't feel that way about it. It's quite conceivable that 20 years could be spent in the KDISD. We hope to get a livable center out there as well, but the next 60 years would be spent in central Houston, perhaps, different periods of time. So I think we need to get away from thinking that this child rearing school age is as big a motivator as it is. My sense is that there's pent-up demand for more of this type of living. And surprisingly, I think in some other parts of the country, people have been shocked by the amounts of families that have indeed moved into some of these types of developments because concerns about the school district are perhaps offset by other quality of life amenities.
And there's another really important aspect to that. When you say moving close, that doesn't mean necessarily moving close to the central business district. I mean, Waller, people here from Waller tonight are going to build a town center. They'll be out at the edge. So you could be close to Warwick. You could be close to Sugar Land. You can be close to the Woodlands. There's going to be a lot of livable centers of all sizes and scales, and they're going to be everywhere. So it isn't as if we're talking about everybody's supposed to move into the Montrose, which, by the way, please don't. Because we can take some more density, but, you know, we don't need it all.
Stephen Kleinberg, here's a question. Why encourage growth? Why prepare for growth by planning when we can be more responsible by opposing endless runaway growth? Responsible Houstonians should oppose growth.
Right. Oh, Carol's going to say something too. I don't know how you oppose. How do you stop people from coming to Houston, because this is one of the most affordable major cities in the country? We are an urban folk. There's what, 320 million of us in the United States now. There will be 400 million Americans by the middle of this century. 80% of us live in cities. People want to live in cities. That's where things are happening. People cannot afford to live outside near New York or San Francisco or Denver or Seattle. Houston is going to have this growth, and the only question is, and, you know, if we could wave a magic wand and stop all growth, maybe that would be a good thing. But the growth is going to happen. The only choice we have is, can we guide that growth? Can we figure out a way to ensure that when Harris County, which now has 3.9 million folk, has 5 million people living in Harris County 20 to 25 years from now, can we have a city that is more green, more beautiful, with more mobility, more attractive place to be? That's the central challenge of the next 15 to 20 years, and that's why I think it's part of the reason why there's this. You know, we were talking earlier about this. There is this moment now. We are in the midst of a fundamental change when no politician is going to run for office anymore without recognizing and being a champion of transit as one part of the solution to transit and mobility. It is a new reality that has emerged, and we need to find a way to push that further along and to ride that wave and to broaden that appeal, and those are the choices, I think. I don't think we can stop that growth, but we can find a way to ensure that the growth makes us a healthier and better place 10 and 20 years from now than it is today.
My cell phone rang before our panel started this evening. It was my sister, who lives in Pasadena, California. She has the good news to report that she and her husband, they're both teachers, have located a home. The price has fallen dramatically, and they're getting a steal, a 2,000 square foot house, $1 million. Oh my gosh.
If I could add a bit to that.
Yes, please.
There have been attempts to limit growth in communities around the nation. And Portland and the state of Oregon had growth management plans. And what that tends to do is to drive the cost of housing up enormously, and so it makes your communities unaffordable. The other city closer to home that tried it was Austin. Some of you may recall in the 80s, Austin tried to pass a growth management plan. And I'll just say, see how it's worked there?
Sir, at the microphone, please.
Yes, in building the infrastructure in reference to education, what do you see the role of universities and K-12 in this area? I'm just coming from an aviation conference in California, and they're dealing with the same thing. They're trying to connect transit to the aviation industry.
I think one quick point I'd make there, and I think Kleinberg and others probably have much more to say on this, but universities are actually oddly underappreciated in federal transportation planning. None of the modeling takes students into account properly, and we may actually see issues even with the cost effectiveness on portions of the university line in Houston based on that. Serving universities with good transportation is actually one of the best things you can do, and it's also one of the best things you can do to get those students to stay around. I mean, it seems to me, I went to Rice, and 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the mentality at Rice was a stay within the hedges, this is a horrible city, get your degree and get out kind of mentality. And I think even having the light rail line and letting Rice students make it downtown, letting Rice students make it to the rodeo, to the museum district, has changed that kind of attitude. So I think universities in particular actually should be a focus of our transportation planning, but because the census and the kind of transportation modeling information we have doesn't take them into account properly, that has been a real problem. And if you look at transit systems all over the country, they actually have, and many of them do not serve the universities well, even though in reality that's a way you get a whole lot of ridership and really improve quality of life.
I think another part to the question is how do we change the culture in the city of Houston so that when every child turns 16, they don't think that's the rite of passage to get a car. And so people have spoken about how the recycling movement actually got its wings by teaching children in elementary school of the benefit. And so we're probably really missing a big part of our opportunity by not having modules that teachers have in the schools about transit and getting people familiar with getting out of the car and not having our children think that, you know, getting a car, you know, you get your tricycle when you're 3 and you get a bicycle when you're 8 and then you get your car when you're 16. So I think we have some work to do there, and maybe I should try to get a grant to do it.
Question specifically for Stephen Kleinberg. Can you explain the paradigm shift in Europe where the populace has shifted from mass transit to personal vehicles? The claim is made here by the questioner, most vehicle travel is now in autos. I don't know if that's the case or not. Do you or anyone else on the panel have any information about that?
I mean, it is remarkably true that even cities with lots of mass transit, people still drive their cars very often, but not as much. And vehicle miles traveled is less, and density does provide alternatives. No one thinks that the solution in Houston will be getting rid of the automobile. This is the most automobile-dependent city in America, and even in Europe, no one gets rid of the automobile. What we're talking about is providing alternatives, providing this multimodal modes of transportation that we've been talking
in financial management, we call this diversification. I think that's the idea.
Well, and I mean, I think some of the stats in Europe are misleading, partially because they actually reflect economic development in some formerly impoverished countries. I mean, I think a lot of you go to a country like Germany and you go to a country like England, and they really do have a lot of public transportation use. The other thing that always amuses me, and I hear this brought up occasionally, is people saying something along the effect of, you know, nobody wants to live in New York City because it's too crowded. The fact is, if you go to places that have good mass transit, you will find there are lots of people who want to live there. And be it New York, be it Boston, be it Seattle, be it San Francisco. And sometimes you may see that housing prices go up. The reason the housing prices are going up is because we aren't making enough good places anymore. There's nothing wrong with creating a good place, we're just not creating enough of them. And if we were creating enough of them, then you wouldn't see that increase in housing costs.
Other question. David Crossley, what is the most effective way to drive politicians towards people-oriented transit? How can we expose developer/politician connections that create Grand Parkway Section E's? Is it as simple as campaign finance reform?
Thanks for the question. Well, I think there's a couple of leverage points, and actually there's more, but HJC, for instance, is a really important place to pay attention to be engaged. They are required to produce a regional transportation plan every 3 or 4 years that looks pretty far into the future, and are beginning now for a 2040 regional transportation plan. And the goals and visions that are in the current one, which is the 2035, were pretty much set by citizens. So it's very important right now to get engaged and make sure that happens again. At the county level, the county commissioners and the county judge make these enormous decisions. They just say, okay, let's use $180 million of stimulus money and build the Grand Parkway, which was otherwise dead. And you have the head of Harris County Infrastructure saying, and so we're going to build a 200-mile road to nowhere, when she said in front of a very large crowd last week. And then so attend. We have actually started, thanks to Steve Hawley, who is our new transportation writer and who has been covering County Commissioners Court. So you can find out what they're doing all the time by going to our website and getting those stories. The biggest thing I can think of that's going to happen in Houston right now is there's been a mixed-use committee that's getting ready to bring some new ordinance forward to council to think about how we're going to deal with these 68 rail stations that we're going to have in 2012-13. What are those neighborhoods going to be like? How are people going to move around? What are the sidewalks going to be like? And, you know, it's very, very difficult to get this stuff through committees and then out in front of council. And everything will change once it gets in front of council committees, because you and others will show up and say, that's not good enough, it's not good enough, it's just not good enough, and it'll get better. And at that point, every time you do that, the whole conversation is elevated. We have mayoral candidates right now who have to confront this stuff. So June, when Carol is unfortunately going to be the brunt of the first round of it as chair of the Planning Commission, they will hear this stuff first. So you can also go to the Planning Commission. They have public comment at the beginning, and you can hear this and talk about what you think about it. So there's only a few places where all this stuff, where you can cause enormous change. And campaign finance reform, sure. Good luck.
Our next question will come from the gentleman at the microphone.
Yes, I have a question regarding federal funding for bullet trains, whether we're going to get into the stimulus package to work to link major cities, you know, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, and for federal funding for a bullet train system, and then also whether is there a way that we can get transit to, if you want to go to the Cynthia Woods Pavilion, you know, you don't have to take your car or try to get a ride, and you know, if that's something that could be worked on. And the final question, as far as accessibility with the lighting to audio signals, to make it more easily for pedestrians that are blind or visually impaired to cross intersections.
Carol Lewis, do you want to take the question on the intercity projects?
There is discussion about some kind of high-speed rail between Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. I don't know at this point how far along it is, and just like the slide that Chris showed with all the steps from concept to, we're not even at implementation, but to trying to get to the point where you're actually ready to accept federal money, there's so many steps there. And so that's where we are with the high-speed rail. It's an idea in people's mind. There are a lot of elements that still have to be worked out, including route and right-of-way and the like. And so they're not ready to accept stimulus money because the condition of stimulus money was that you needed to have a ready-to-go project. So we're very far from that. But I think people will be working on that concept, and we'll just have to keep our eyes open and antenna up about how rapidly it progresses.
Christoph, anything you want?
Yeah, I think I would add to that. There's a private company called the Texas High-Speed Rail Transportation Corporation, I believe, which is studying something called the Texas T-Bone, which would indeed do that. At this point, they do not have state government backing, and they have not done any alignment studies or environmental studies. Other states, California, for example, has done a full environmental study for a system. They have had there's a state agency dedicated to building it, and they have had the taxpayers pass a bond issue to fund part of it. So other states are way in advance of where we are here, and fundamentally what needs to happen here locally is our state government needs to step up and be part of that. The other thing that's actually interesting is we need to get ourselves on the map. The federally designated corridors connect San Antonio to Dallas, and they connect us to New Orleans, but they don't connect us to Dallas or San Antonio or Austin. So there's actually corridor designations that need to happen as well. But fundamentally, this is something where our state government needs to step up and get its act together. I mean, literally, Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood was here, and somebody asked him about high-speed rail in Texas, and he said, you need to get your act together. And so that, I think, would be a message to take to your state legislators, to say to them, we need to get our state government looking at this and seeing how this can happen.
Are there any,
one little thing about that. It's also important to get local here. When I went to the high-speed rail transportation conference in Milwaukee in 2000, and I saw the map that shows San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, connected to Oklahoma and so forth, and us just not connected to Texas at all. I came back and gave a lot of speeches about that. And people were shocked. How could this be? Well, how it could be is that the Dallas congressional legislation was way ahead of the Houston congressional legislation. And do you think that was an accident, that Houston's just hanging on out there, you know, down on the Gulf Coast all by itself, not part of America even anymore? And I have to say, that was 9 years ago, and the new map that the president showed last week still shows us not connected to the rest of Texas. That is a local problem. That isn't a state problem, so it needs to get fixed.
Can I just add a couple things to that? The House version of the TxDOT Sunset Bill includes creating a Texas government entity called a Texas High-Speed Rail Corporation. So there are things going on. And also there's money in the transportation, there's some federal transportation money that LaHood pushed to study putting Houston into that system. So that some of these things aren't as bad as we think. And there are some national level people thinking Texas is in a much better position than some other regions to institute high-speed rail. Right-of-way reasons. There's various reasons we're in a better position, too.
Oh, and there is one thing to note here politically, which is the Texas High-Speed Rail Transportation Commission's had a series of workshops across Texas to discuss this. The Houston workshop was hosted by Continental Airlines, and the Dallas workshop was hosted by American Airlines. And the head of this corporation is the former Harris County judge. There is actually some serious political muscle behind it this time, and so I do actually give it a decent chance.
Maybe I'll ask Jeff Table this question. Should we see ourselves in partnership with other cities in the same position as Houston, or are we in competition? This question of receiving funds, making design plans, and so forth, are we in competition or are we in partnership with other cities?
Maybe competition.
Well, I think the answer is both. With the highway funds, those are allocated, and I don't know the exact formula, but it's exactly as Christoph said. We're kind of allocated with an assumption of a certain level of need that's based on population. With the transit funds, it's the opposite. There's this smaller relative to the demand bucket that we've got to compete against. So the answer is both. I think in the HGAC region, though, the competition is a very important point. And I want to just make this point when we talk about the Grand Parkway. Our Transportation Policy Council voted for that project unanimously. So when we talk about alternatives, I think it's very important that there's something in it for everybody. And that's why we're excited about livable centers as a concept. Like David said, you know, you can be Waller, Texas, Alvin, Texas. One thing I think that hasn't created competition perhaps away from some of the traditional projects is a lot of the local governments don't see anything in it for them. You know, I don't have a big highway in my community, but I think it's going to be better for growth if we get one. Now, if we have a new program that says, gee, I could get some improvements and help redo my town center, maybe I'd rather have some of that than vote for the Grand Parkway. So I think that kind of internal competition could be very healthy, but just putting on my regional hat for a minute, I don't know, how many of you people are from Houston tonight, live in Houston, Texas? Anybody live outside of Harris County? Okay. Well, again, I think if we talk about solutions that are perceived at least as favoring Houston or Harris County solely, we'll have some barriers to cross. I think if there's a way we can all prosper together with whatever approach we come up with, then we are more collaborating than competing.
But to follow up with another question, or the same question, Christoph, you've basically posited a scenario where the bureaucracies have implemented a rivalry between urban needs and suburban ex-urban needs. There's no mystery that this conflict may not exist. But if that's the case, it would seem to me that the urban centers of our nation would have every interest in working together and throwing their combined weight at the bureaucracy, and would probably have far more success in making changes together than apart. And so doesn't this notion that we're competing for tax dollars, in fact, perpetuate that dynamic?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely true that on a national political level, urban and suburban interests have tended to be neglected. It's amazing to me how highway congestion is not actually a national political issue, but subsidies for ethanol growing is. And it says something about our political structure that actually urban and suburban. I mean, I think if you live in the suburbs, these issues are as much your issues as if you live right next to downtown Houston, have tended to be neglected. So I do think there's some extent to which everybody needs to sort of fight to say these are important national issues. There's also an issue to which we all want to be part of these networks. High-speed rail is a really good example. Part of what makes high-speed rail work is that you have a local distributor network on each end. You know, if you are in Houston and you want to go to Dallas, I don't care if there's a high-speed rail to get you there. How are you going to get from that high-speed rail station to where you actually want to go? There's a good transit network on that end. If you don't have to rent a car on that end, you're going to be much more likely to take that train. So in a way, we are all interested in being part of this greater network that we have just started building. Now, highways versus transit isn't actually an urban versus suburban fight. We have spent plenty of highway dollars in urban areas, and there are plenty of transit needs in suburban areas. In fact, I think one of the biggest arguments that's shaping up here, if you look back 15 years, I think the politics in Houston were transit versus no transit. I think today the politics are about what kind of transit we want. You see those numbers up there. Everybody wants transit. The disagreements that are coming up now is, should we be spending money on urban light rail versus suburban commuter rail? But even those rivalries are driven a lot by the fact that the pots of money are limited. I think the answer is yes and yes. We need to serve everybody. We need a system that serves a whole wide variety of areas, a whole wide variety of needs, a whole wide variety of travel types. And to some extent, this is about expanding the pie rather than fighting over the pieces of it.
Okay. I think we're out of time. Barry, we've run out of time. Is that all right? Have to be.
Let me add one.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Robert.
The Cynthia Woods Metro Pavilion, we would love for...
Your mic on. I think there's a switch on the back.
Closer, there we go. Yeah, big difference. We would love for a regional system to connect to the woodlands from downtown Houston. I think as I read the tea leaves, that's very difficult right now. The Houston system is really a local system, and Express is not part of that system. So if you compare Houston with BART and most other cities, that component is lacking. I think it's purposefully lacking, but it doesn't, it's going to make it very difficult for some of the outlying communities to participate.
Okay, that's going to wrap it up for the panelist section of our evening. Again, thank you very much. Robin Holzer, who is chair of Citizens Transportation Coalition, is going to take just a few more minutes to tell us what we can do to make a difference. And thanks to all the panelists. Robin has done a great job putting this together along with Jay Crossley. So give them a big round of applause.
Can't be both. You got to pick.
Jay, can you help me make the screen come back? Or somebody? Yay, magic. I'm only going to take a couple of minutes because we've heard a ton of great content, but a couple of folks have asked the question, so now what? What do we do? And so my mission is to convince you that you should do more than just go home tonight thinking, wow, I sure learned a lot. That was cool. If that's all you think, we've failed tonight. Couple of things. There are lots of ways for individuals to participate just one-on-one. You can go to meetings. You've heard about some meetings. Folks were asking about high-speed rail. There's a high-speed rail meeting in Houston next Friday the 29th at the George R. Brown. So there are going to be more additional opportunities for you to show up and participate and raise your voice and talk about what's important to you. There are also opportunities for organizations to participate, and I want to focus on one briefly. There is a resolution document that was available outside that you may or may not have picked up that is all about building support for transportation alternatives. So far, I think 18 organizations across the region have said, yeah, we believe that our transportation agencies should invest in transportation options for all users, not just roads, not just bicycles, not just transit, but we need to support all our users. And so I would encourage you to take one of those, and if you're a member of a civic group or a business organization that might agree with that idea, please consider formally adopting it. Another thought, it's already been said tonight, but elected officials really do listen if you open your mouth and say something to them. We've been told some rules of thumb that one letter is equivalent to probably 20 or 30 or 50 petition signatures. And even petition signatures are worth more than people who simply yell at the TV and complain to their neighbors. So actually talking to your elected officials makes a difference. A phone call can matter, an email can matter. And what's really interesting is what happens when we do it all at the same time. So a letter from you is one thing. 10 more letters that say the same thing, that we believe that investing in transportation options for all of our residents is important, can really change things. I want to focus on two examples I've heard about, things where we're seeing it happen. Here at the state level, we heard today, just today, that the Safe Passing Bill passed in the Texas House. It's one of the bills that a bunch of our local organizations have been focused on throughout the spring legislative season. It passed the Senate 6 weeks ago, perhaps, and it passed the House today. There'll be more joint committee work, but we are very close to having brand new legislation in Texas that says motorists have to pass other road users safely, kindly, not in a, I'm going to say bad words anyway. But you have to be nice to stranded motorists and bicyclists and construction workers and the people on the roadways. And that's important from a safety perspective. People aren't going to pursue other options if it's not safe for them to do so. That bill is very close to passing, and you could help make it happen just by contacting both your senator and your state representative in the next couple of days. So that's very close. A second example happened at the federal level. You heard a little bit tonight about Transportation for America, which is a national coalition of organizations that want to see transportation alternatives. They were already up and running. We weren't involved yet, but they were up and running during the stimulus debate. And as a result of organizations being plugged into this, hey, let's be on the same message at the same time thing, the funding for transit, that component of the stimulus bill, was dramatically increased as a direct result of people like the folks in this room talking to their congressman and their state senator kind of all at the same time on the same message and saying, this is important, we need to fund it. So that's already happened. We can do more of that. Carol said at the beginning that the Transportation Reauthorization Bill, this big piece of federal legislation that says what are we going to spend federal dollars on, that process is going to come out this summer, and it's kind of shooting for the September timeframe. So I would suggest to you that if you have thoughts about what should our cities grow like, what should we invest in, that you want to be plugged into that process. Ways you can do that, first and foremost, is if you're not already on our email list, there's a sign-up sheet out front. If you didn't sign in, please do, and we can keep you plugged in for that. And the second thought is, if you know folks across the region who might think the same way you do, get them plugged in. If you look at our region, this is a map. That red loop in the middle is the 610 loop, and what these shaded areas are all of the congressional districts in our region. If we're all talking to our Congress critters at the same time, that becomes, 9 or 10 or a dozen voices in Congress who can be pushing for things that benefit our region. So we can really make a difference if we all pull together. And with that, I will thank you very much for coming out. I apologize that we're ending later than we hoped, but we had a fantastic array of content and expertise at the front of the room, so I'll ask you to thank them again. And unless I'm forgetting something, the last bit of homework, you got a comment card, or you got cards, everybody got cards? Please leave these with us before you go, whether you had a comment or a question. Our intent is to capture all of this information and aggregate it so that we can share it with our Congress people. So please leave these before you go, and otherwise, have safe travels home. Thanks. Oh, I failed to thank our host. Thank you, Mia, moderator.
Yes, we've got a